let me put in my 2 cents here with this schematic. So this was my attempt to put together the ARF model, which you can see kind of on the right as a stair step, starting with perception, going to attention, going to emotion, to memory, persuasion, sales, and so on. With the inference engine suggested by Karl Friston's work and Lisa Feldman Barrett's work. So you can see on the left, within this person's head, we've got innate survival instincts, probably at a cellular level. We have the experiences of that individual from the beginning, from even prepartum. Those things are feeding in data into this prediction engine. They're also creating motivations. The experiences and the survival instincts are creating motivations, and the motivations and the prediction engine are interacting with one another. So an ad stimulus coming in, if it resonates with the motivations in the individual, then that will be detected subconsciously and lead to an ad response, which will go some part of the way down through the levels and might make it to sales. Persuasion is where there's actually a change in the perception of the brand's capability to satisfy some motivation. So this is kind of my attempt to fuse together the ideas that we're talking about here. So I'll stop sharing and maybe ask if Michael and Zab would have any comments so far on what Jerry said and perhaps even on what I just said.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Bill, I think your schematic is, although simplified, is pretty spot on. And yes, you need that whole funnel, that whole pathway to get from perception to action and then anything sustained. Of course, there are feedback arrows from those various downstream components, such as emotion or motivation. So what we attend to, and even what we perceive, is shaped by, in a sense, what we're looking for or what we need at that moment. So if you're hungry, that will turn up the salience of food-related cues in the environment. If you're thirsty, fluid-related cues, et cetera, et cetera. If you are, an anxious individual, that will turn up the sort of vigilance system. So cues to threat, cues to loss will be amplified through that processing chain. And then also things that are intrinsically significant, especially for humans and humans as primates, also get kind of stronger arrows in there too, like social factors. So just the presence of other individuals, but their states, their expressions, their what they're experiencing, I should say. And then also that kind of theory of mind inference into what's going on there as well. So it's simplistic. I think it is, spot on though, in terms of how we should be thinking about this whole thing. And I do appreciate it being couched in active inference rather than, so rather than thinking about the brain as a homeostatic, device, that's not really the right way to think about it. It's constantly making predictions and then doing statistical inference to see whether we're meeting those predictions, exceeding those, right, or falling short of those predictions. And that's where the dopamine system is really important, right? So it's not a pleasure chemical at all. It is signaling when things are better than expected, right? Better than forecast. And it says, hey, do that again. Hey, look at that again. Remember that. And if it keeps being better, expectations keep being better than it, or you keep exceeding expectations, that's also a signal that the world's getting better, which turns up drive and turns up motivated behavior, repetitive behavior, turns up optimism in a sense. And when when the world is failing to meet expectations, then you see the reverse of that. So that's what leads to things like despair, like which unfortunately a lot of the modern world is, I think a lot of people are experiencing. And so that what would normally be repetitive things that would be rewarding, like going out and seeing people or buying things or having sex, frankly, we're seeing a lot less of that, I believe, because the state of the organism is one that's sort of retreating from the world, which is not a good time to go out and search for mates, kind of in an evolutionary sense. The other part that I would build into this, that's why I talk about primates, is that, I mean, Bill said, it's the experiences even pre-birth, and I would say pre-human. So we have the accumulated experiences of our, and I don't mean like in some conscious way, but built-in wiring, right, in terms of prioritization of certain things in the environment, certain kinds of experiences based on what turned out to be really useful for our ancestors. And I mean that going, way back, tens of millions of years. So for primates, for example, the need to be social, the sort of comfort and instrumental value of support from other people, which is again another thing that is failing to meet those expectations for a lot of people in modern life. And I would point you to is a really, really beautiful piece. That's the cover article of The Atlantic for February by Derek Thompson, which is very well researched. It's very deep, and it pulls together a lot of folks' work over actually going back about 40 or 50 years, really highlighting that the really deep penetrance of social factors for our behavior, for our emotions, for our attention, for our quality of life, and then what that ends up making us do, right? And the sort of demotivation if we're not having those kinds of connections and the impact of technology on it. Okay, that was saying a lot of things, but I figured we're all saying a lot of things in a short period of time because we only have a half hour here. So
yeah, Michael, I think to your point on the homeostasis versus like the allostatic piece of things, I think that's I think one of the key things there. And I think the other piece, Bill, about the schematic is, one thing we might work on is that it's a didactic kind of like, communicative process. I think we end up in this very linear, like we do this and they stepwise through it. And like you said, Michael, it's much more complex than that. But I think that we could take a look at what you're saying about embodiment in the world itself, embodiment within culture, the things that we offload through technology in terms of our decision making, all factor into that. In some ways, I think active inference brings some structure to that I'm not doing justice to in a very small amount of time. But I think it's an interesting way to like build a first principles approach to marketing and communication that ends up just being folk wisdom in most of marketing.
Yeah, for sure. Folk wisdom, it's like in a lot of neuroscience, a lot of cognitive neuroscience is really honestly folk psychology, because so much of it is reverse inference driven. And that's a good way to kind of at least try to put words to do some data storytelling. You do some imaging experiment. You're like, oh, look, the VMPFC lit up. Somebody felt reward or something like that. There are more advanced, sophisticated approaches, which we've started to take advantage of, which at least do that in a principled way. Using AI, using machine learning. But the other thing I want to throw out there too is that, and this is why I think in terms of the marketing stuff that we've been talking about, Bill, and that we're going to be trying to sell, where we really go into the world and do this, where we can sort of really discover what's happening, is that the sort of lab-bound, benchtop approach to understanding the brain is so constrained and so limited. You vary one or two things typically, right? And that's in its standard cognitive neuroscience or neuroscience experiment. Very little of that, has been tested in terms of generalizability outside of the confines of like lying in a scanner or sitting in front of a computer screen. And, you know, like we published papers, we published a landmark paper last year in Nature where we recorded activity from thousands of neurons in monkeys who were freely moving and engaging and doing all the things that they do. So in that case, they did like 30 or 40 different things. And what we found many interesting things in that paper. Could do a whole session on that. But one thing we did find is widespread availability of information about everything that I'm doing, everything you're doing, what we just did in the past, and our history of interactions and our intentions and who's watching us and who's next door in places where it really shouldn't be based on what was in the lab. So when you talk about a what and where pathway, it's sort of instead all over the place. So there's a broad availability of information, which we think is makes a lot of sense, again, from this predictive coding, because you need to know the context you're in time, in space, right? And in social space, in order to interpret data that's coming into the brain, in order to retrieve the appropriate memories, in order to calculate value signals, and in order to make decisions. So that's something I'll throw out there. And I think even, Bill, our initial stabs at like, for example, looking at brain responses to ads embedded in media, right? And embedded in media in different devices, that already is kind of taking some of the blinders off. And we see that that's really important, right? And I think that as we do more of that, we'll learn a lot more about that as well.
The brain state really is in the natural environment. So, that's, and we're going to get there with what we have planned, in the home, because people will be doing more natural behaviors, right? But it's still just a small step.
And I think what I like about the active inference work as well, while it's very theoretical neurobiology based, it does bring in that cultural piece where that's an abstractive layer above it that constrains the choices that are made. Like how I interact with others in the world has a lot to do with the choices that I make beyond just putting me in a lab and presenting me something and asking me out of context, would you like this more or not like this more? So that's why I think the RMT stuff in the real world is really exciting.